The 30th of November, 2000, London. A 17-year-old girl from Bareilly, India, is standing under lights she never trained for, wearing a crown she never expected to win, in a competition she almost didn't enter. She came from a small-town army family. English wasn't even her first language of comfort. And in a matter of minutes, she becomes Miss World, and the entire trajectory of her life bends in a direction nobody, including her, saw coming. That girl is Priyanka Chopra, and what happened after that crown is not the fairy tale people like to tell. It's messier, harder, far more human. Because winning a title doesn't erase where you come from, it just puts a spotlight on it. And for years after that night, Priyanka would be told, in 100 different ways, that where she came from wasn't enough. This is the story of how she stopped shrinking herself to fit other people's comfort and started owning every chapter of her story, even the ones the industry told her to hide. Think about what that actually means for a moment. Most of us picture success as a straight line. Talent goes in, recognition comes out. But that's not how it happened for her. Her line zigzags. It doubles back. There are years in this story where, by any outside measure, she looked like she was losing. And that's exactly why it's worth slowing down and really looking at it. Because the parts people skip past in the highlight reel are usually the parts that actually built her. Let's go back further, before the crown, before the cameras. Priyanka Chopra was born in Jamshedpur, India, to two doctors serving in the Indian Army. Because of her parents' postings, she moved constantly as a kid, different schools, different cities. Even a few years living with relatives in the United States as a teenager. She's spoken about how disorienting that was. You don't get to plant roots when you're always the new kid. You learn instead how to adapt fast, how to read a room, how to survive being the outsider. That skill, adapting without losing yourself, would end up being the thread that ran through her entire career. But first, it got tested in the cruelest way possible. She hadn't even planned on entering pageants seriously. By her own account, it was almost incidental. A photo submitted, a competition entered somewhat on a whim, and suddenly a small-town teenager was standing on stages, in front of judges evaluating her on a global scale. There was no years-long grooming process, no industry machine built around her from childhood, the way there sometimes is for beauty queens or child stars. She was, in a very real sense, thrown into the deep end, and she stayed afloat. But staying afloat and being embraced, those turned out to be two very different things. She won Miss World at 17, and almost overnight, she was thrown into Bollywood, one of the most brutal, image-obsessed film industries on the planet. Here's the part most fans don't fully sit with. Priyanka wasn't considered the acceptable kind of Bollywood beautiful when she started. Indian cinema, for decades, worshipped a very specific, very fair-skinned ideal of beauty. And Priyanka has spoken candidly in interviews over the years about growing up being told her skin was too dark, being called names for it as a child, and even trying skin-lightening products herself at one point, because the world around her made her believe that was the price of being seen as beautiful. Think about that for a second. A Miss World title holder, a woman whose actual job was to represent global beauty, was still made to feel like she didn't measure up by the industry that hired her. That's not a plot twist you'd invent for a movie. That's what actually happened to her, in real time, in front of the whole country. She took roles early on that leaned into glamour, because that's what was available to a beauty queen crossing into film. And the industry loved boxing her into that. Pretty face. Song and dance, nothing more expected. But something in her kept pushing against that box. Quietly, film by film. Here's what made that pushback so risky. In an industry built on image, choosing to disrupt your own image is a gamble with no guaranteed payoff. If a glamorous star tries a dramatically different role and it flops, the industry doesn't say, "Brave attempt." It says, "Stay in your lane." She had every commercial incentive to keep playing it safe, to keep taking the roles that photographed well and asked nothing uncomfortable of her. Instead, film by film, she started chasing something riskier: range. Here's her turning point, the first one. It came through roles like fashion. In 2008, playing a supermodel who spirals into addiction and self-destruction before clawing her way back. And then Barfi, in 2012, playing a young woman with autism, relying almost entirely on physicality and restraint instead of dialogue. These weren't vanity projects. These were roles that could break an actress's image completely if she got them wrong. She didn't get them wrong. Fashion won her the National Film Award for Best Actress, one of the highest honors in Indian cinema. And it proved something the industry hadn't wanted to admit, that the beauty queen could act, really act, not just occupy a frame. Then came 2014's Mary Kom, where she played the real-life Indian boxing champion Mangte Chungnejang Mary Kom. She trained physically, changed her posture, her walk, her whole presence, to inhabit a woman who fought her way out of a small village in Manipur to become a world champion boxer. It's almost poetic. Priyanka playing a woman who literally had to fight, physically, for the right to be taken seriously in a sport that doubted her, while Priyanka herself was fighting a quieter, more psychological version of the same battle in her own industry. She's spoken about the physical transformation that role demanded. Months of boxing training, reshaping the way she moved and carried herself, stripping away the glamour entirely to disappear into a woman from a completely different world than her own. There's a particular kind of courage in that, taking the very thing people once reduced you to, your look, your image, and deliberately dismantling it on screen, in front of millions of people, just to tell a story properly. Most stars protect their image. She was willing to risk hers to the role justice. Here's the principle from this stage of her journey. And it's simple, but it's not easy. You don't earn respect by avoiding the roles that scare you. You earn it by doing the ones that could expose you, and doing them so well that the doubt has nowhere left to live. Priyanka didn't argue her way out of being underestimated. She just kept choosing harder work. By the early 2010 seconds, Priyanka Chopra was one of the biggest, highest paid actresses in Bollywood. With a career spanning dozens of films, a genuine music career with international collaborations, and a household name status across India. By almost any measure, she'd made it. And then she did something that, on paper, looked insane. She walked away from the top of one mountain to start climbing a completely different one, from zero. Picture the actual math of that decision for a second. She wasn't a struggling actress with nothing to lose, gambling on a long shot, because there was no downside. She was giving up guaranteed lead roles, guaranteed box office pull, guaranteed status, to go sit in casting rooms in a country where nobody owed her anything, where her decades of Bollywood success meant almost nothing on a resume nobody there had read. That's not the move of someone chasing comfort. That's the move of someone who'd rather risk everything than stay comfortable in a box that no longer fit. In 2015, Priyanka signed on to star in Quantico, an ABC network drama, playing FBI trainee Alex Parrish. And here's what people forget. This wasn't some safe, guaranteed transition. She was already a massive star in India. In America, she was a complete unknown, stepping into an industry that had, at that point, never once put a South Asian actor in the lead role of a network drama in television history. Not once, not ever. Reporters, executives, and industry insiders openly questioned why she'd risk it. Why trade guaranteed superstardom in one country for the very real possibility of failure and obscurity in another? She's talked about this period as terrifying in its own way. Walking into rooms in Hollywood where nobody quite knew what to do with her, where the industry simply didn't have a template for someone like her leading a show. Here's the hidden struggle most people don't clock. When Quantico was being cast, Priyanka has spoken about telling the network something very specific. She didn't want to play a stereotype. She didn't want to be cast as the Indian character, defined only by her ethnicity, reduced to a cultural checkbox. She wanted a role that was, in her words, ethnically ambiguous, a part where her talent, not her background, was the headline. That took nerve. She was a newcomer to American television, with basically zero leverage, making demands most fresh faces in her position would never dare make. And it worked. Quantico premiered in September 2015, and Priyanka became the first South Asian actor in history to headline an American network drama. The premiere pulled in strong ratings, well above expectations for its time slot. A year later, she won a People's Choice Award for the role, becoming the first South Asian actress to do so. The show that people thought was a career gamble became the moment she rewrote what was considered possible for an entire generation of actors who looked like her. The turning point here wasn't just landing the role. It was refusing to shrink her own story to fit the room. She could have taken any part just to get her foot in the Hollywood door. Instead, she used the one thing she had, a fierce sense of who she was not willing to become, to negotiate a role that didn't ask her to erase herself to be accepted, and it's worth pausing on how quietly radical that was. She wasn't storming into rooms making demands. By most accounts, she was polite, professional, easy to work with. But underneath that ease was a line she simply would not cross. There's a difference between being difficult and being clear about your own worth. And she seemed to understand that difference instinctively, at a stage in her career where most people in her position would have said yes to almost anything, just to survive the transition. The principle from this chapter is this: you don't have to disguise where you come from to belong somewhere new. Sometimes the exact thing people expect you to hide, your background, your accent, your unconventional path, is the very thing that makes room for you where no room existed before. But let's not pretend the road smoothed out from there, because it didn't. Once she crossed into Hollywood, a new kind of criticism showed up. Back home in India, some accused her of abandoning Bollywood, of chasing Western validation, of turning her back on the industry that made her. In America, meanwhile, she was still fighting the reductive instinct of an industry that often didn't know what to do with an actress who didn't fit its narrow categories. In 2017, she took a role in Baywatch, her Hollywood film debut, playing the villain opposite Dwayne Johnson and Zac Efron. It was a big, commercial, unapologetically fun studio film, and a calculated risk. Critics were mixed on the movie itself. But for Priyanka, it wasn't really about that one film. It was about proving she could exist inside the biggest, most mainstream tier of American entertainment, not as a token, but as a lead. Around this same period, she kept building something most people underestimate. She wasn't just acting, she was constructing an entire ecosystem around her career. In 2015, she founded Purple Pebble Pictures, a production company aimed at backing regional and independent Indian cinema and giving other underrepresented voices the platform she once had to fight for. She later co-founded a hair care brand, Anomaly, applying the same instinct. If the industry isn't building the thing you need, build it yourself. None of this happened in a tidy sequence either. She was juggling a Bollywood filmography, an American television schedule, a growing production slate, and a business venture, all at once, all while critics on both continents kept trying to decide which version of her was the real one. She never picked a side in that argument. She just kept working across all of it, as if the question itself, Bollywood star or Hollywood crossover, actress or entrepreneur, was the wrong question to begin with. This is the second turning point worth sitting with. Priyanka stopped waiting for opportunities to be handed to her in the shape she wanted and started manufacturing her own shape entirely. Acting, producing, entrepreneurship, advocacy. She stopped being defined by a single lane, because staying in one lane is exactly how an industry keeps you controllable. There's another layer to her story that doesn't get talked about enough, and it's her long-standing work as a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador, a role she's held for close to 2 decades, advocating for children's rights and education. In 2022, she was honored with the Danny Kaye Humanitarian Award for that work. It's easy to scroll past humanitarian titles in a highlight reel, but consider what it says about the arc of her story. A girl who was once told her own image wasn't good enough by beauty standards, grew into a woman using her global platform to fight for the dignity of children who have no platform at all. That's not a footnote. That's the whole story circling back on itself. There's something worth sitting with in that circle. The version of her that once felt not good enough because of how she looked grew into the version of her spending decades advocating for children who are judged, dismissed, or overlooked for reasons entirely outside their control. Pain like that rarely disappears, but it can get redirected. Hers did. In 2019, she wrote her memoir, Unfinished, where she opened up publicly about many of these struggles, the colorism, the criticism, the loss of her father, the years of feeling like she had to prove her right to exist in rooms that didn't build a chair for her. Publishing that book was its own kind of turning point. It's one thing to survive hard chapters privately. It's another to hand your own story to the world, unfiltered, and say, "This happened, and I'm not ashamed of any of it." That's really the principle underneath everything Priyanka Chopra has built. You don't get to choose whether people judge your story. You only get to choose whether you tell it with your head down, apologizing for it, or you tell it standing up, owning every messy, complicated, unfinished piece of it. She chose the second option over and over again, at every single stage where the easier move would have been to stay quiet, stay safe, stay small. Notice the pattern running underneath every single chapter we just walked through. Miss World, criticized for how she looked. Early Bollywood, boxed in by an industry obsessed with a narrow idea of beauty. Quantico, underestimated by a country that had never made room for someone like her. Baywatch, doubted as a serious crossover. Every time, the response wasn't to disappear, it was to keep showing up, keep doing the work, and let the results slowly dismantle the doubt. That's not luck. That's a habit. And habits can be learned. And here's the thing about her path that should matter to you. Whoever you are watching this right now, wherever you're sitting with your own version of doubt tonight, Priyanka Chopra didn't have some secret advantage the rest of us don't have. She had rejection. She had an industry that told her, in 100 quiet ways, that she didn't fit the mold. She had critics on 2 continents who questioned every major decision she made. What she also had was a refusal to let any of that decide her next move for her. Every single turning point in her story came from the same place. She stopped asking permission to be exactly who she was. She didn't wait for Bollywood to stop caring about skin tone before she built a career on skill. She didn't wait for Hollywood to have a template for someone like her before she stepped into a lead role. She didn't wait for permission to build her own production company, her own brand, her own platform. She built the room and then she walked into it like she belonged there because she decided she did. That's the part of her journey that's actually usable for you tonight. It's not about beauty pageants or box office numbers. It's about this: somewhere in your life right now, there is a version of you that's shrinking. Maybe you're editing your background before you mention it in a job interview. Maybe you're staying quiet about where you started because you think it makes you look less impressive than people who started further ahead. Maybe you're waiting for someone, a boss, an industry, a room full of strangers, to give you permission to take up space. Priyanka Chopra's whole story is proof that permission was never coming. It had to be taken. Every chapter, the small town girl, the criticized beauty queen, the underestimated actress, the unknown newcomer in a foreign industry, the woman labeled a sellout by one side and an outsider by the other. She didn't erase a single one of those chapters to make her story more palatable. She used them. She let them become the texture of who she is, instead of the thing she had to hide to move forward. That's what owning your story without apologizing actually looks like in practice. It's not arrogance. It's not pretending you don't have doubts or setbacks. It's refusing to let the parts of your story that make other people uncomfortable become the parts you're ashamed of. It's understanding that the very things people once used to underestimate you, your accent, your background, your unconventional path, your failures, your years of being told you don't belong, those aren't liabilities. Those are the exact details that make your eventual success impossible to copy. So here's what I want you to do. Not later. Right now, while this is still sitting with you, think about the one part of your story you've been minimizing. The messy chapter, the setback, the thing you don't lead with because you're worried it makes you look less capable. And instead of hiding it, I want you to name it. Out loud or in the comments below, put one word, just one word, that represents the goal you're chasing despite that chapter. Not the polished version of your story, the real one. Because somewhere out there, someone is building their own version of a crown they never expected to win, in a competition they almost didn't enter. And the only thing standing between where they are and where Priyanka Chopra ended up is the decision to stop apologizing for how they got started. If this story moved you even a little, hit subscribe and come join the Golden Grace family. Because this is exactly the kind of story we tell here. Week after week. Real paths, real setbacks, and real proof that your unfinished chapters are not something to hide. They're the whole point. Drop your one word below. Let's see how many golden chapters are sitting in this comment section right now.